Good morning, everybody. We're going to get started. I'm Paige Bischoff. I'm Senior Vice President of Global Public Affairs at ARM, and I'm joined today by Amy Nicole Nayar. She is the Vice President of U.S. Patient Engagement and Government Affairs at Novartis Gene Therapies. So we're really thrilled to have all of you here today, and we're really thrilled to be talking about the patient voice. I think all of us in our sector know innately how important that patient voice is. What's been really exciting recently is to see that both the PDUFA 7 commitment letter and also the draft legislation for Cures 2.0 both talk about adding that patient voice into the regulatory perspective and decision-making going forward. So we know that every path for every developer is going to be different. It'll be unique to the developer, to the therapy, and then also to that patient community. And while Novartis was one of the first gene therapies to receive FDA approval, Amy Nicole's not going to go into a deep dive on that particular case study, but rather she's going to help us elevate the conversation to best practices across the board. But before she and I get started on our conversation, we did want to introduce you via video to 3-year-old Lincoln. He is living with SMA, and we're also going to hear from his mom, Katee. And a little bit of background on the family. Their first child, Landry, passed away at 6 weeks of age, and the family was told that the cause was SIDS. Later, when Lincoln was born, Katee and her husband really felt like there was just something not quite right, and they took Lincoln to the pediatrician and were assured that everything was fine. They continued to persist and ask for more testing, and at 11 weeks, Lincoln was actually diagnosed with SMA. And at that point, they began to suspect that Landry probably also had SMA that was undiagnosed. So once the diagnosis began, the family started a pretty epic battle with insurance companies to qualify Lincoln to be able to receive Zolgensma. They also started the trials of living with the child with SMA and everything that that means for not only the patient, but also the family as caregivers. But at 11 weeks, or actually in November of 2019, he was able to receive Zolgensma, and also they've been thrilled now with the progress that he's made. So we're going to hear in just a moment from Katee telling us a little bit about Lincoln. The videos that you're going to see are her home videos, and all of the wording on there is her wording as well. This is what she's posted to YouTube, and she's graciously allowed us to have. So without further ado, please meet Katee and Lincoln. Hi, Katee. Thanks for being with us today.
Hi, Paige.
So first of all, we want to know all about Lincoln. Tell us about his personality, what he's like, what he likes to do.
Lincoln is a delightful 3.5-year-old. He loves to sing. He has a huge catalog of songs all in his brain, and he sings all day long. That is definitely his favorite. He's actually very happy, really talkative, chatters all the time, doesn't have quite the best communication skills yet, but he's always talking. And he's a typical boy. He loves trucks, anything with wheels and balls. Lincoln's respiratory has improved so greatly. All of the secretions and the phlegm, the mucus, those are far less than what they used to be, and something that he can now manage on his own, which is huge. Also, being on his back, he even had to travel in a car bed for so long, and now he's graduated to a normal car seat. And I actually have video of him the first time being upright, and he just talking, being able to see everything out the window was just so phenomenal. He's louder. You can hear him cough, sneeze. When he was little, you barely this like tiny little achoo. You're like, what is that? And now it's an actual sneeze. He also has gained and maintained weight, and that is huge, a huge milestone. Pre-Zolgensma, he wasn't even on the growth chart. And now he's in the 25th percentile. And that is just a huge victory for us. And on a daily basis with all of these things, they have what has made Lincoln to be a happy, cheerful, delightful, playful, talkative, wonderful young man. I think that the parent caregivers should be consulted during the process on what their expectations are with the therapy and the benefits they hope to gain and how they hope it'll improve their lives going forward. Zolgensma literally can be life-saving and it's the difference between a life being ambulatory or not. So cost benefit analysis seems obvious. Like, obviously I want to give this child anything I can to give them that opportunity. Honestly, just that he stays with us and stays healthy. That is the main biggest goal that we want for Lincoln. But we want a quality of life, and I want him to be able to have an education, have a career, travel, have a family if he wants, to be independent. That is something we greatly, greatly want to be able to see, is him to have more independence and do things on his own. But mostly we just want him to be with us for a long, long time.
And there's more good news. Lincoln is going to be a big brother. Katee and her husband are having a baby girl in 2022. So before we get started on our Q&A, I know we have a little bit of disclosure housekeeping. So Amy Nicole, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, thanks so much, Paige. So I do have to make a statement that my participation here is not for the purposes of promoting Zolgensma or any other Novartis product. I did not collaborate on, nor am I responsible for the comments made in the video that we just saw. I'm really here to elevate how we all work to better bring that patient voice into our work so that we can do what we do best, which is accelerate bringing therapies to the patients who are still waiting. And I want to thank ARM for prioritizing this session, because it really does keep us grounded in why we are all working so hard to bring advanced therapies forward. So thank you.
No, absolutely. It's so great to have you here. So let's build on that, because we saw the power of the patient voice, and I think we all know that, but we certainly saw it with Katee. We're encouraged, as I mentioned earlier, about PDUFA 7 and about Cures 2.0, talking about incorporating that patient voice into the regulatory process. But from your perspective, how are regulators, how are payers actually currently engaging with that patient community?
Yeah, I see the regulators increasingly putting structure in place to better incorporate the patient voice into their decision making. And this is so important. This can be done through, I think, even the patient stories. And as scientists, for a long time, we thought, well, it's an anecdote, right? It's a story. Now we're really realizing it is the holistic picture. It is the ultimate benchmark by which we should look at a disease and look at a therapy. And so there is a role for patient stories. We're seeing that increasingly. But regulators will be looking at those patient stories and wanting to make sure that they are representative of the patient population as a whole. And so data is really important here, the patient-reported data.
I'm glad you mentioned the data. That is, as you said, incredibly important. And I think it also tees up increased use of real-world evidence. So where do we stand with that? And can you kind of walk us through maybe how you've seen that evolve a little bit?
For sure. I think you know, with this new legislation, proposed legislation coming forward, these new opportunities, we're going to see unprecedented ways to use real-world evidence. And I would say a really important opportunity is to combine the patient and the HCP entered information. And here's why. The real value there is, if you ask any caregiver of a pediatric disease or any patient, they can tell you that the best HCP cannot ascertain within a 30-minute quarterly office visit the true impact of a disease or a treatment on their patient's life, right? So if you're with a child day in, day out, you can really see them and the impact on their lives of a treatment. We want that incorporated into the regulatory decision making. We want that, and so do regulators, right? Because it is that holistic view of the impact of these therapies that we want to prioritize. And so what we're looking at is this opportunity, and it's a little bit, we're of two minds right now, because we want the guidance, because if we're going to work to generate this clinician and patient-entered data and match it, we want it to be usable. But we also need flexibilities, because as our understanding about how to incorporate this and how to collect this emerges, we need that flexibility. So we're a little bit of two minds there. But we do know that ultimately what we want to do is incorporate endpoints into our trials that are meaningful to all parties involved.
So how does that apply on the HTA front, and maybe a little bit more with the payers, where their decision-making in many cases has not had the opportunity to incorporate just what you were talking about? So the combination of the patient and caregiver feedback into the equation. And we just saw Katee, and she was talking about how after Zolgensma, Lincoln is now able to ride in a car seat instead of lying flat in the back of the car. And what she didn't have time to explain in the video is that what's really important about that is that he can now clear those mucus plugs himself, which he could not do previously, which actually allows him to be able to sit up in that car seat. And that's huge. She is not panicked while she's driving anymore when he's lying flat. So how do we incorporate, again, what to some people might seem very small progress, to her is huge, as we're talking to these HTA bodies and then also the payers?
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, if we think about payers, health technology assessors, they haven't always traditionally considered a patient story in their decision making. But I think accompanied with patient and clinician data, these quantified, representative patient stories really do serve a role, because they are the ultimate benchmark of what payers are paying for, right? They are paying for that whole impact on the family. And I think that payers and health technology assessors are working to get better at incorporating patient input in a meaningful way into their value assessments. I would say maybe our learning edge there is to really make sure that not only is patient perspectives and patient input incorporated and acknowledged appropriately within a health technology assessment review, but that it is incorporated into the final recommendation. That's really important. Sometimes we've seen it as a paragraph kind of off to the side and then not used in the final recommendation, and I would ask why.
So let's talk a little bit about your early stage company. You want to reach out to the patient community that will be helped by your therapy. Are there best practices in how you do that, how often you do that, who does that? What does good look like in that situation?
There are a lot of learnings here. Yeah, there are a lot of learnings here. And this is something that's often underestimated as well. Some folks just think that you see a patient story, it's so powerful, it's going to speak for itself. But there actually are real best practices and ways that work in engaging with the patient community. Remember that these families are often working on a volunteer basis, but they're also increasingly the first investors in research, right? They are driving research. They are investing, the first to invest in research in their therapy area. They are setting themselves up to be our research partners, and we need to recognize that. So the way that we engage them really does need to be appropriate in that way. I can share a few lessons learned. For example, one of the things that all of us will do is try and establish the economic burden of disease. And we were looking to do that. We were doing an economic burden survey. And we were looking to administer it in a patient population that had been very responsive to other surveys in the past. And we got 6 responses and 100% abandonment rate on our survey. So we knew the problem was with us, because this was a group that had been very responsive before. So the first thing that we looked at was our respondent burden. And in the rare community, that these are patients and caregivers that have a very high burden of disease already in their lives. So if we want them to contribute their data, we need to be very sensitive to how burdensome our surveys are, right? And this just highlights why we need to increasingly work with payers and health technology assessors to hone in on exactly what information we need to obtain so that we don't, in our enthusiasm for patient-entered data, we don't burn out our respondents, right? We can't collect everything. We have to get that agreement on what we collect. So that was number one. But then why only 6 respondents? Why were people not responding to our survey when they had responded to other surveys in the past? And this was because we recognized that we weren't going to share the data back with the community. We were going to take the data and use it for our own purposes. And that's a principle that doesn't really work for the community anymore. You know, these families want the data. They want, and so the best way that I've seen this done is actually through a multi-stakeholder collaboration, you know, often led by a patient organization who brings together and convenes multiple different partners, and that can really speed the answers that we need by pooling all of our resources together and doing that in a real collaborative way. This is the model really moving forward.
I know that Katee had told us that there is a Facebook group that she's a part of, there are other groups, and that parent community is very close and very tight, and they trust one another. How does a company, a developer, earn that trust of those families, kind of building on what you were just saying?
Yeah, I think it really is listening to what they need. So there have been several mistakes that we as a community of cell and gene therapy developers have made in the past, and you know, one of them I think is engaging with the community, listening, and then going back and making our own decision. If we don't ask that final question, which is, and if we do it this way, what will be your response? Will you stand up for us? Will you make a statement in support of this? Will you work with this? Without asking that question, you might not like the answer. If you don't ask it, right, you might find out that you don't like the answer. So it's really important that there is a formal and informal, highly respected, and a bi-directional dialogue. You know, I think the best way that I've seen patient engagement done is by having a patient engagement officer or team acting as a hub, right? So bringing identifying opportunities and galvanizing expertise inside the company and outside with the patient community, and really being that connector, because this is where we can identify opportunities and really achieve efficiencies. One of the things we were just talking about, so if you think about patient-reported data, and you have several different functions within a company. So the same patient-reported data can be used to help our regulatory team with their engagement with the FDA, help our access team with their engagement with ICER, help our clinical development team design our trials. Also, as new policies are created, like a newborn screening has been established, when that happens, we begin to see the true incidence of a disease for the very first time. And all of our teams, our medical, our commercial, our analytics team, need to update our plans based on that emerging incidence and that information. If you had each one of those functions reaching out to the patient organization, probably the same patient organization, through their own lens, this is a way not to do it, right? So not only is that disrespectful of the patient organization's time, because they're repeating themselves with information that they've already shared with others within your organization, it's really disrespectful, it's inefficient. We can't afford to be inefficient. We are speeding therapies to the patients who need them. So if you have one hub, one patient engagement team that has that multifunctional mindset where they are thinking and they're being exposed to the development of a survey, and they're thinking about all of those different functions at the same time, this is where you can really maximize the synergies, and we and the patient community are really empowering each other.
So building on that, for early stage developers, many people are wearing many different hats. You're trying to juggle hiring decisions. When is the right time to bring in a patient engagement professional, and at what level should that person be? Also, what happens if that decision isn't made and someone else in the organization who doesn't have that background takes on that role?
That's a great question. I would say start early and realize this is business critical. Several of the companies here in the room have hired their patient engagement officer at the C-suite level in the first 5 hires, and we've seen their success. So this is clearly something that is recognized by several of the members here, and it really works. I think that when we look at de-risking the investment we are making, it's clear that patient engagement is a tool. It's not only the right thing to do to engage the community, but it's a way to de-risk our investment. And what we see is that there are some amazing statistics on this. Things like 20% higher likelihood of getting to market with good patient engagement, 40% speeding on trial enrollment, and really on the converse, millions of cost efficiencies, missed opportunities, and delays when patient engagement isn't done. So if anyone's interested, ping me and I'd be happy to share those references. I think it really is, it is essential that we recognize that patient engagement is not a nice to have. And to your point about what level, it really does belong at that C-suite level because it requires that multifunctional mindset and it requires that level of prioritization because it is that pivotal for the cell and gene therapy space for us to be able to truly, efficiently bring the therapies to the patients who are still waiting.
I think sometimes not only do we learn from best practices, but we learn from mistakes that have been made. You and I talked about a couple of things that happen on a fairly frequent basis. Instances where, for example, somebody might feel that, well, if I sponsor a certain gala event with a patient group, that's patient engagement. So can you share with us maybe some thinking like that, although incredibly well-intentioned, didn't really have the desired result?
Absolutely. And this is, I'm so glad you brought that up because it really is, everyone is well-intentioned and we all want to help the patient community. We all think of patient support in a different way. And this is an emerging science, right? This is an emerging space. And so several well-intentioned colleagues will think, sure, we need to support the patient community or we need to ask the patient community for their input on a trial so that we can say that we did, right? So we don't, obviously, what we're really seeing is there's a real value. They're helping us when they give input into our trials. They're helping us be more successful. And they're helping themselves because they want that new treatment to be successful. They want us to be successful too. So it's a positive. But when you're engaging a patient organization, what we want to do is we want to be transparent because the last thing we want to do is discredit our partners. So if we are, let's engage them for the reason that that we're really intending. So if we want engagement in a trial, there are these great things called the RAPs, the reasonable agreements between patients and the pharmaceutical industry. There are 4 of them. They're available on the Synergist or patientfocusedmedicinesdevelopment.org, and that organization worked with 20 different companies, including ours, to develop these lay language contracts so that, and they're a great boon for the patient community because the same patient group can use this same contract with 4 different industry partners in the same space, and they don't have to hire a lawyer in order to know if they should sign it or not, right? It's in lay language, and there's one for an advisory board, there's one for a consultation, there's one for a collaboration, and then there's one for a speaking engagement. And then that combined with a fair market value calculator to compensate patients for their contribution, for their time, this is the appropriate, transparent way that we should engage with patient groups, doing exactly what we say that we're going to do so that we can continue to work together and so that we all have a credible voice and that all stakeholders are truly being informed by these very valuable patient partners.
Let's go back a little bit on the policy side. I think one of the things that is sometimes surprising is that you assume that if you're in lockstep with a patient advocacy group on X, that you probably will be in lockstep with them on policy going forward. That isn't always the case. So sometimes there's a surprise when a very sophisticated patient advocacy group in its advocacy takes a different position than a developer. How do you, as a patient engagement professional, think about that? And then how do you also help to sensitize that not only within your company, but also kind of within the broader community that you're working with, just acknowledging that not everybody's going to agree on everything all the time?
Yeah, and I think that's okay. You know, in short, it's okay that we don't all agree and all the time. Everyone has their own, each stakeholder has their own perspective, and although we want to work together, there's a reason, just the same way there's a reason that we have different functions within the company so that people are intentionally looking at things from a different lens. There's a reason we're all different stakeholders, payors, regulators, patient groups, industry. There's a reason, and there's a benefit from that diversity of thought. And so it's not always such a bad thing. The other thing I'll say is that oftentimes when we don't like what a patient group has to say, they can be right. So we might be not thinking about it in the right way. So it's really healthy to get that insight so that we can have that aha, and we can actually realize maybe we haven't been thinking this through with a fully informed perspective that they have from their side.
So kind of keeping in that same vein, as we talk about including that patient voice more in regulatory decisions, payer decisions, to a certain extent, our community, our sector, is innovative and transformative in ways that maybe traditional pharma has not been. What do we as a sector need to do to educate, along with the patient community, the HTA bodies, the regulators, the payers, about what is unique about transformative therapies compared to what they might be used to dealing with?
And it's a challenge, right? So way back early when I was doing my Doctor of Pharmacy degree, I was doing a rotation as a managed care pharmacy benefits manager. And I remember looking at, okay, I'm talking hyperlipidemia 1 minute, SMA the next minute, oncology the next minute. How can we expect that person to truly understand the nuances of type difference and phenotype and the sophistication that is within rare disease on its own, let alone the sophistication within advanced therapies? So we have to work to educate. We have to work to shape that understanding and partner on what I love to hear yesterday was the announcement of this, and correct me if I get the name wrong, but is the transformational value narrative that ARM has planned for next year. And so is it okay if I ask you a little bit to speak on that? Because I absolutely think that is a big answer to your question.
Well, that's great. So what we're looking at for next year, we've had a lot of really successful meetings with policymakers at the state level, at the federal level here in the US, and definitely with policymakers in Europe as well. And they're all very interested in how we as a sector think about value and how we can communicate value as opposed to cost. And so I think we've taken a great step if we can have them thinking about value and not just focused on cost. I think that the value is recognized along with innovation. So what ARM is planning to do for next year is really dive into the next layer of how do we communicate value, what does that look like, and particularly for HTA bodies around the globe, for policymakers around the globe, legislators, as we seek innovative payment models, as we seek to crack the code on reimbursement, we need to flip thinking that's existed for decades and decades. So that's what we will be working on, and we will need a lot of help from everybody in this room to continue to do that. So
I love that idea.
Well, I'm sure we'll be working closely. Amy Nicole, thank you so much. Great insight. Thank you for sharing both best practices, things that we should be aware of and not inadvertently do that we hadn't thought about. And really appreciate your time and your insight, and particularly in how to communicate and the importance overall. I think the C-suite and the hiring is really helpful to know. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.
All right, great. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks.